I'd like to believe it, but I'm really suspicious into the way the releases and even the way you are reporting of it. It sounds very reminiscent of all sorts of SDS talking about information. I really want to believe it. Why aren't you saying what did Cheryl do?
Well, I wrote to him and asked him what Cheryl did, and apparently what happened was this. There was a riot on the university, and she saw some police. Of course, now, when you have a riot on a university, some of the students may not even know it started, until hours later. The administration may not know till days later, as a matter of fact. So, anyway, the students, apparently what happened was she simply saw police attacking certain people. She yelled at them. Now, I don't know what she yelled. I don't care what she yelled, as a matter of fact. She yelled something at the police, maybe an obscenity, it may have been something, to stop it. I have no idea what yet. But she yelled something at them, and then they proceeded to grab her. And that's the report I have. Now, as far as the incidents, these incidents occurring, I do believe this because I corresponded with Fred Woodward personally in addition to the things I've read about it. And, of course, he could be totally lying, but unless he is, I believe him. I have no reason to believe he's lying. Secondly, as far as the occurrence of such incidents like this go, I think you can ask Gary Greenberg, who's a New York lawyer and is in court quite often, about whether things like this do occur or not. Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah, I agree it should be factual. Yes.
Let's see the trouble with me here, Jarret. I'm looking under the state by anything. But, there's no reference to any lawyer. There doesn't seem to have read at any point in this whole process. He went to the police station 2 times. He said he was. Did he ever go to see a lawyer?
Oh, he contacted a lawyer, yeah. Later on, afterwards, after this had happened. Firstly, you got to realize, he may not first know a lawyer or have a lawyer he goes to as a matter of course. So he'd have to find someone who he thought could really help him to begin with. And this could take more than just the few hours he spent trying to find out something about his wife. And secondly, it seems rational just to go down there and try to find out. What's one thing you might do. Yes. Yeah, right. Selling, and it's not only selling, it's selling, possession, consuming, and anything. Most of them were probably for possession, as a matter of fact.
If the possibility exists, for example, that a drug might affect some children,
yeah.
How do you decide how to regulate that?
Well, you don't regulate what someone does with their own body. Now, if the consequence of something they do with their own body, harms either themselves or harms an unborn infant, that still doesn't give you a right to regulate their own body. I would be against regulating it on that basis. Yes.
I found most of your speech very interesting, and probably agree with a lot of it. You seem to make no distinction between the policeman, you call Amelia Scott, simply that, and a criminal in the sense that he knows what he's doing. He's going out to commit a particular act, whether it's trespassing, stealing property, or killing.
Yeah.
And a policeman who may be totally wrong and objectively commit a wrong act, yet doesn't believe he's committing the wrong act. In other words, he's been brainwashed.
Well, see, my opinion is of this as far as the moral nature. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And in talking this way, it seems to me, don't you feel like not making this distinction, sort of glossing over this distinction, you make it worse for the libertarian movement because they really see police simply as criminals, and the reaction to that is simply throw a rock at them. If I saw a criminal, I'd shoot him down.
Well, you can't simply throw a rock if it's a very big criminal gang. So that doesn't mean that's a rational, response.
You're still not same point, and maybe I'm not expressing it properly, but the point is you don't seem to see this distinction.
Oh yeah, I'm going to discuss. Yeah. And the question is there any difference? I guess the question, or isn't there a difference between policemen who don't think they're engaging in moral acts and criminals, or other criminals, and I'll tell you why in a second, who recognize that they are engaging in immoral acts? And my answer is, other than that fact, there's morally no difference. I think there are two components of the morality of an action, basically. And one, you might call them metaphysical and epistemological, or a person's intentions and his actual actions. So, for example, one important aspect of the morality of what a person does is actually what actually took place. If, did I shoot you? Did I harm you? And so on. The second component, what was my intention? Did I go out and premeditate the act, in which case I'm guilty of first-degree murder, or was just my gun misfired, in which case it was manslaughter? So there are two elements, what I intend to do by my acts and what I actually do. Now, as far as damages I owe you, in just the plain economic sense, this is totally dependent upon what actually I did. It doesn't make any difference whether I committed manslaughter or first-degree murder as far as what I owe to your heirs or anything like this. Okay. Now, the second component of the intentions, I think, apply in the moral sense only this far. The intentions only apply to whether or not I intended to do something which was a violation of your rights. It isn't necessary for me to be immoral to know that I'm violating your rights. I think morality is objective. It doesn't require an individual to recognize that, yes, in fact, murder is immoral for it to be immoral. He's still engaging in a wrong act if he intends to kill you, even if he intends to kill you thinking that he's just doing something that's proper or moral because the state said so or something. He's still guilty, in my opinion, of first-degree murder if it was done with premeditation, intent, and the actual effect was to kill you. That's basically, in essence, my ethical standard. So by that standard, as far as I'm concerned, they are criminals. They may not be aware that they're criminals, but that doesn't change the fact that, by my standards, they are. Let's see. Way over there, Ralph.
In conjunction with what you said about the happenings in Tucson, land people, I'd like to point out we have a defense fund that the money which is going down to them, only like about $1.50 so far, and a lot of you are out there would like to help out in this form of justice. And if you want to send some money, when you look at the address down in Tucson, with the defense fund. So that's with that.
Okay, yeah. Well, to answer the second question first, if Hitler was sincerely convinced he was engaging in great acts, that wouldn't substantially, in any important degree, as far as I can see, reduce his evil. All we know is that instead of being consciously evil, he doesn't realize that he's evil. But that doesn't change the fact he's a moral monster, as far as that goes. What was the first part of the question? Yeah. Okay. Oh, I think it's what he was sincere about doing good things. I personally think he was mentally disturbed. I really do. Yeah.
Trying to change our image of the police.
Yes.
The only action that I thought that you advocated for us to do was to resign if we were already police chiefs.
Well, I definitely agree. If you're a policeman, you should resign. Matter of fact, I've looked over some of the literature and things you have to sign as far as papers, and I don't see how any objectivist or libertarian right away could be a policeman, because one of the things you have to sign is a pledge of loyalty to enforce the laws of the state, basically, of which, by the way, there's something like an estimated 5 million laws in the country today. It's just virtually impossible to know them all to begin with, and you shouldn't go around enforcing things you don't know, or be subject to someone saying, well, look, here's a law you should enforce one day. And secondly, of those 5 million, I'm very sure that probably well over 4,900,000 are immoral laws, as a matter of fact. And so consequently, I don't say he could be a policeman.
There is something you can do. You can make policemen pariahs. They're already having a very high retirement rate. It's very hard for a policeman, at least living in New York, to hold his head up. Everybody hates him. And
By the way, the alternative, just for the benefit of people like myself, also who do believe that police conceivably can perform a proper function and is a moral good to grab real murderers and muggers and thieves and things like that. There are an increasing number of private police forces in the country. I saw something on TV in Washington D.C. that just acres and acres of property in Alexandria, Virginia, which is right near Washington, is now patrolled by a completely private police force, and their only function is to keep people off that property. They don't violate people's rights. They don't chase them for drugs. They hear private policemen performing a moral function of protecting property. So the alternative isn't simply to say, well, we can't have any, we won't have any police. We'll be at the mercy of all these criminals. Actually, there are not that many criminals compared to the people in the government, but in any event, there are private policemen, and something like I think it was $1.5 billion was spent 1969 on private police protection, various kinds. This is not just simply company night watchmen. This is real private police forces too. Let's see. Yes. Oh, that's a very interesting question. Well, basically, the question was, how would you equate a policeman who went to the police department to avoid being drafted and a soldier in the field? Well, just since you gave me an opening, I'd like to comment about soldiers in the field also. I think you have a sort of a very similar situation, but to a much greater degree. If you've read some of my articles, like The Philosophy of Defense, you've seen that I don't agree with the way war is being fought today at all. I don't believe in basing your defense upon the victimization of millions or even thousands of innocent victims. And I think I'm all in favor of national or social defense. And I'm in favor of preventing communists or any kind of totalitarians from taking over any portion of the world, as a matter of fact. But I don't think the way you go about it is by dropping napalm and say, well, if there are 1,000 people in a village and 900 of them are communist and 100 are innocent people, well, it's the way it goes. Too bad for the innocent people. Or point atomic weapons at the Soviet Union and say, well, most of these, it's too bad about most of these people. We recognize that they're semi-slaves and they don't have any choice about the kind of system that they're under and they can't do much about it, but we're going to kill millions of them anyway. Now, the point is not that you should say, well, take the other alternative and simply say, well, this means that we're just going to be wiped out by the Soviet Union, or it's better, at least we'll die pure or we'll be conquered, but we won't have killed any innocent victims. There's a third alternative. The third alternative is to develop techniques of warfare and defense which don't necessitate millions of innocent victims. For example, in the case of something like full-fledged atomic weapons that you have to deal with, the logical thing to do in the case of weapons like that is, firstly, if you possibly can, is to sabotage them before they ever get off the ground. Promote a revolution in the country which is aiming them at you to get rid of the people who are aiming them at you. Sabotage your communication system. And also, if you can, I don't think they can today, but if you can, develop a means of just purely defensive means to shoot them down if they happen to launch one, an effective means. So this is why I think the proper way of going about defending yourself. It's defense. It's not saying we're going to have a mortgage on 1 million innocent people to protect our own selves. If you come down to an alternative of you or them, I personally would pick me, okay? But I don't think you should be faced with that kind of alternative. Now, as far as to get back to your question, well, I definitely agree that a person should avoid the draft if they can. There are a couple things involved. First thing, was that the only way you could avoid the draft? If it wasn't, then you should have found some other way that doesn't involve getting involved with trying to enforce these awful and immoral laws. The second thing, if that was in fact the only way that you could avoid the draft, I don't know what to tell you. It's a question of what do you value, more. Do you value more staying out of prison, than you do becoming a criminal, or at least in becoming partially a criminal? I don't know what else to tell you. It's a moral decision that, and I personally am glad I wouldn't have to make And it's a very difficult one. I can't tell you definitely, which way to decide. I don't think it's an awful, if that's the reason, I don't think it's an awful thing to become a policeman, no, if that's the motivation. I would definitely, if I was in such a situation, I'd try to avoid every enforcement of every moral law I could in every way I possibly could. Is the only thing I would do. Yes. I think in the first place that every human being, starting from the age 0, birth, and starts out owning their own life. And when I'm 5 years old, okay, if I'm 5 years old, I decide that I want to leave home. Matter of fact, a lot of kids in England in the last century reputedly left home when they were 6 and 7, or actually pushed out of home when they were at this young age, and a lot of them did manage to survive. Anyway, if I decide that I'm at 5 years old that I want to leave home, and this is my own choice, I don't think anyone has a right to use force to bring me back. Now, as it turns out, most kids who run away from home come back the next day because they don't like it, and they forgot a few things like where they're going to get food from, where they're going to sleep, and a few other little details like that they didn't think of before they ran away from home. So very few really young kids stay away from home like that. I think the ones that we're talking about actually are probably more like teenagers. The basis to make the decision is the basis to make the decision is the following. I think every human being has an absolute right to their own life starting from the age 0. Period. Now, if the kids want to stay at home, the parents can definitely place all kinds of, set up all kinds of rules and regulations on the basis that's their house that they're, that the kids are living in. It's their food that they're eating, and so on and so forth. So, the parents have a right to exercise control over their kids. The more general principle, I think, is a general rule. The age at which a person can say that the parents have no right to control him is very simply the age at which he's self-supporting, or which he no longer gets any support from his parents. If I'm 6 years old and some kind of genius and I can go off and earn my own living, why the hell should my parents be able to tell me what to do with my own life? Yeah. Yeah.
What happens if, say, somebody has a contact with the police force, you protect me, and you have them take care of it. If that person's murdered, they capture the guy who killed him.
Right.
How do you take care of that? You bring him up before...
You have a private court, too. You have a private court. She's No. Okay. 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 There are a couple things involved in this question. As far as the basic question, I think sort of resolves to what's to prevent private courts or police forces from engaging in inhumane and monstrous acts in retaliation for crimes. Yeah, it's a good question. It's certainly a valid question. And there's, I think, the second component of the question. I'll answer that first. Is what's to prevent them from having all kinds of different and even conflicting kinds of ways of dealing with crime? Okay, and let me answer the second part of the question first. Now, to prevent as far as the different ways of dealing with crime, I think we all recognize that this country is not like one unified thing, and even what we term government is not one unified organization with everyone sitting there nodding their heads and agreeing, and every law is perfectly consistent with every other law, and the laws in every state are perfectly consistent with the laws in every other state. As a matter of fact, already today, there's widely different punishments for crimes. Let me give you one example. In Illinois, they recently passed a very libertarian-type statute which made any form of sex between consenting adults legal. So consequently, there's no punishment, for any kind of sexual act in Illinois between consenting adults. On the other hand, Georgia and the other 51 and the other 50, how many we got? The other 48 states, the other 48 states aren't quite that liberal, unfortunately. So the punishment, I think, is in Georgia for all kinds of unnatural sex acts, which is everything but the normal man on top position. That's everything else practically. The punishment for unnatural sex acts is life in prison, even the couples married. as a matter of fact. So now you ask, what's to prevent the private agencies from enforcing all kinds of contradictory and inhumane punishments? Okay. There are a couple of things that prevent such things from actually being enforced either in today's society or an anarcho-capitalist society. That's basically the thing that if I think in Georgia they really did try to put someone in life imprisonment for this act, and people found out about it, they'd be outraged. So one thing that restricts, and this is one fundamental factor for limited government or for anarcho-capitalism or whatever, the thing that restricts what these agencies can and cannot do, finally, is the morality and ethics of the people in the society. If you live in a society of cannibals, you can expect to get eaten, even if you have a limited government. It's unnatural in Georgia, right? And there's another question in this vein that's very interesting, and people continually ask, and the question is continually, what's the guarantee that your competing agencies won't go off and kill people or be fighting in the streets or things like this? And the answer is, very simply and honestly, there's nothing to absolutely guarantee this. But neither is there anything to absolutely guarantee that your most perfect Randian government, assuming it was set up properly to begin with, your most perfect Randian government won't get some corrupt dude in there as a policeman or a magistrate or a legislature and do the exact same thing. As a matter of fact, all the historical evidence indicates that this is exactly what happens. The governments do get corrupted. Now, there are certain advantages that the free market agencies have over the government, the one single government. The first and most basic one, in my opinion, is a psychological or psychoepistemological advantage. That is, that people don't regard a competing agency, if it's a true business, they wouldn't tend to regard it as something sacred, whose flag we must die to protect. They wouldn't regard it as something beyond criticism. They wouldn't regard it as a particular kind of entity which could engage in actions which you and I can't. And that's exactly how they regard, the present government is regarded. It's okay for the policeman to arrest people, it's okay for the policeman to imprison people, but you try to do the same thing and you become a criminal. Two moral standards, one for the government officials and one for the private officials. Why this dichotomy? The dichotomy exists because government exists outside the market. It's not just another agency, it's one of a special kind, and consequently people regard it as different. Now, you wouldn't have this problem with free market agencies. Also, again, as several people have pointed out, with free market agencies, since you had competition, if one became really corrupt, you would have another to turn to. As we see today, if the government, if you take drugs and the government knows about it, there's virtually nothing you can do. You don't have a private police agency to protect you. You should have one. Maybe one will be developed. But at the present time, you don't have one to protect you and they can grab you. And the answer basically is this whole issue of what's to prevent corruption. There's nothing to guarantee man's action. People have free will. They can always act wrongly, regardless of the legal forms that they have. It doesn't. This is not what determines whether or not you have corruption, the legal form per se. What determines it is basically the ethics of the people, particularly the people, the leaders in the society, the intellectuals, the agent, and the people who work in these kind of agencies. Yeah. Yeah. Not the members, the person himself. Yeah, the person that was murdered. Yeah, this is, I'll just repeat what he's referring to. My booklet, Society Without Coercion, I discuss the concept of punishment and justice, and I say, well, what's justice in the case of someone who's been murdered? What would justice consist of for him or to his heirs or whatever? Now, the first thing I said was that in case he has heirs, I think there's a debt of a specific kind incurred to them. If a person who was murdered was supporting a family at a certain level of income, and now he's taken away from them, and he had intended to support them for another 20 years or whatever, the person who killed them has a debt to his heirs. Now, let's assume that there are no heirs in this case. Now, what is possible restitution for murder in a society? Basically, what I said was that a person incurs, in a certain sense, an infinite debt. He's totally destroyed the person's capacity for action, for efficacy in society. He can't any longer carry out his plans. Can't continue his life. So what I suggested was that the murdered person, before he dies necessarily, be able to prescribe with the justice agency of his choice the punishment for his murderer, if he was in fact he was killed and they did have a first-degree murderer, which led to all kinds of esoteric and exotic punishments that one could conjure up. Now, as far as this goes, whether you really would have, I think ethically, I don't see any reason to change my opinion on that. I think ethically it's sound. I would like to do more thinking in that area. But beyond that, I think that whether or not you could have exotic punishments in society would really depend upon basically the ethics people in your society held. Generally speaking, it's obviously not going to be economical for an individual to go out there and try to capture criminals any more than it's economical for you to try to build your own automobile or build your own house. You delegate it to specialists. You buy their services. So consequently, it would really depend upon the code of justice that a justice agency used. I tend to think it's really interesting. A lot of people would go for that, and others wouldn't. I'm not sure. You might have it. I don't know. Anyway, yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah, certainly. Well, okay, yeah. Now, as far as the conflicts go, of course, different courts today make different decisions. Even when the Supreme Court rules that such and such is the case, you have to inform a defendant of his rights, or you can't use information collected from him, prior to informing him of his rights. Even if they rule that, every day courts submit into evidence information like that. They don't always obey the Supreme Court decision. So just because we have a legally final authority, even that today, doesn't guarantee that their rules of procedure are going to be followed. So again, we do have 50 states. We do have a variety of different local jurisdictions and courts, and they do conflict already today. Now, the basic thing is this. The problem isn't if there's just some differences between them. That's not the main problem. Whether they're going to award $1,000 or $1,500, or whether the guy is, let's say he's going to be detained. This is another issue. Whether the guy's going to be detained for 10 days or 2 weeks. This is not the major ethical issue, the exact kind of punishment. But you, of course, can postulate widely varying differences. Now, in order for you to have a society, a uniform geographical area, basically society is a group of people who, among other things, subscribe to a common ethical background. If you have one group of people who believe in cannibalism and another group of people who don't, they can't really peacefully coexist very well. Okay, so consequently, by necessity, you can have a society with widely differing institutions, procedural differences. So the answer is basically the society would necessarily, by definition almost, have a common legal principles on which it operated. And it could differ in detail, but it couldn't differ on those basic principles, or it wouldn't be. By definition, society would have two societies. They couldn't geographically coexist. The Tannehills deal with this, and basically what they suggest, and I think it's a very good solution, is that you can have basically it's done on the basis of a contract. An anarcho-capitalist society is a society of contract between individuals, as opposed to a society of decrees from the government. What happens, the amount that's paid for goods, the kind of education, is based upon contract. Now, as far as the number of appeals, this again could be sort of a market function, and basically people will desire to have some recourse and appeal. So you could have a level of appeal court. You could write in who is going to be the appeal court and so on. It's no problem. Okay, there's a difference though. See, firstly, Roy mentioned in his debate this morning that he didn't agree with Rand's definition of government, and there are a couple of reasons for this. Okay, I could go. I've got a list of principles which I'll be publishing in a future article in the Individualist about what I consider to be proper basis for definitions. But one thing I don't think you should do when you're defining a term, unless you have, if the term is not contradicting anything in reality, if it doesn't contradict itself, is completely reverse historical usage. Now, governments historically, if you look at them and see what they are, you take the Aristotelian method of definition, see the existent entities that have been so named, and looked at the unifying and essential characteristic of them, you'll find that historically, governments have always been agencies not of protection of individual rights, but of violation of individual rights more than anything else. Rothbard suggests the way they originally were formed was from nomadic tribes which went around robbing this town and the other, suddenly got the bright idea of settling down in one town and staying there all year round, as a matter of fact. Anyway, historically, governments have not been agencies of protection of individual rights. So if you define government as an agency of protection of individual rights like Rand does, several interesting things happen. In the first place, all these things that have historically been called governments can no longer be called governments. They have to be called something else. They weren't agencies of individual rights. And in addition, the present United States, whatever, you can't call it a government anymore, the present United States government is not a government by this definition. It doesn't primarily protect individual rights. Look at the budget and see what they're spending money on. They're not spending it primarily on protecting your rights. Yeah. No. You're. Yeah.
Between government and the state.
I don't make a personal distinction of. I don't think it's any significant difference. There's a certain usage difference, but they're essentially the same as far as I'm concerned. The main thing I was trying to get across is that government isn't just simply some peaceful agency which protects our rights, and for some reason or another, market reasons or some kind of mysterious social contract has a monopoly. It historically, by definition, is an agency which violates individual rights. It's an agency of predation against the individual. And if what Rand calls a government, I don't think to begin with should be called a government. Frank. Well.
What you're doing here is you're ascribing to her definition by non-essential, which I would say is the same thing you were doing. Now, I can give an example of something Barbara Brandon brought up in her mention for it. And I don't know exactly what it's called, but an example makes it clear. All ethical systems have been religious in the past, almost all, just like almost all or all governments.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, is it proper to say, any non-religious system,
Well, again, I think that I think there are many non-religious ethical systems, even though, I see what you're. Okay, all right. See, basically, what I'm saying is this. The method which Aristotle used was to look at all the existent things and see what is the essential characteristic of what you're talking about. Okay. Now, what I'm saying is simply this. I'm simply commenting on one aspect of this question. To discuss the whole concept of defining different concepts would take quite a long time. Yeah, but. No, I think the essential characteristics of government, it has more than one. I don't think it's either or in this case. I think the essential characteristic, the way I define it, is a monopolistic social authority which attempts to control some of the actions of people within its jurisdiction by the use and or threat of force. That's the way I define it, government myself. And I think that includes about 3 or 4 major characteristics. I don't think just one. I think there's several involved in it. What I'm saying is this. Yeah. Rand has two. Rand has. Okay, I'm sorry. Go on. Okay. Yeah, I just want to say one more thing about the Rand definition. She has 2 basic things that she says that appear in the form of sort of a definition about government. One is she says that a government is the means of placing the retaliatory use of force under objective control. Is one of the things that she said about government. The second, Yeah, I know. I said that. Like I said, there are 2 main things that she says about it, and the other is that it's a agency which holds the right to enforce certain rules of social conduct within a given geographical area. Now, these are the 2 things she said about it. Now, if you look at what she calls governments, and what she says about them and what she considers to be the essential purpose of a government. She obviously considers to be the function of a government is, retaliation. It's not initiating force. And she considers it possible, she considers it possible to have a government which does not, in fact, initiate force. And what I'm saying is what historically has been referred to as, not what she says a government, but historically what has been referred to as governments initiate force as an essential characteristic of what they are. Well, I don't think we can settle this right now. Yeah. I don't think you should leave all these different organizations, social organizations, nameless, and that's what you would do if you discarded that differentia. Yeah. Well, I don't think that's, I think the essential characteristic is that they initiate force. Anyway, can I take one more?
One more question.
Yeah. No. Okay.
Thank you, Jarret. Somebody left a notebook up here. I don't know who it belongs to. I'm going to leave it here. I'd like to make just one or two last-minute announcements. One